Hi everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I was just caught in a little bit of a downpour, and I figured I'd start this introduction before I go and dry myself off. It felt a little bit fitting because today my plan is to talk about when the volume that you dissolve your dye into makes a difference. And we're going to play around with this using some immersion techniques where in some examples we will have our concentrated straight from the dye stock dye. And then in another example, we're going to take that 1% stock solution from our dye stock that is as concentrated as I usually mix dyes and dissolve it in a bigger volume of water before pouring it onto our immersion yarn. So then we can see the difference. In both cases, we'll have the exact same amount of dye, but we're going to create two very different colorways out of this. Now, before we go and get started, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. But I also want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Kat C. Kat, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. And I'm really excited to talk more about this project. So let's go look at some colors. Today, I plan to play around with 3 Jacquard acid dyes. These are 1% stock solutions of silver gray, turquoise, and hot fuchsia. Now our blue and our pink are colors that do spread a little bit more than some other acid dyes, but I think even with their spreadability, we should see a difference when we add the same amount of dye in different volumes to 2 different pans of yarn. And if you're curious, a 1% dye stock is 1 gram of dye in 100 milliliters of liquid. And if this is a little confusing, it is still a percentage by weight because 1 milliliter of water weighs 1 gram. Today we're going to dye a total of 400 grams of KnitPicks Swish DK yarn. We'll have 200 grams of yarn in each of the pans that we're setting up today. Swish DK is 100% superwash merino wool. And if you want to learn more about the yarn or any of the other tools and equipment that I'm using in my videos, I will have links and affiliate links to everything down in the video description. And I may make a commission if you make a purchase through one of my affiliate links, which are very clearly marked so you know which is a regular link versus affiliate link. But oh, this yarn has been pre-soaking in just plain tap water. I haven't added any acid yet. And it's pre-soaked for a couple of hours, but with this particular yarn base, around 30 minutes would be sufficient. We're gonna set things up cold on the countertop because I think we can do a nice side-by-side this way versus going back and forth between 2 cameras or 1 camera that I moved from one side of the stove to the other. Now in each of these 4-inch deep full-size catering steam pans, I have 8 cups of water and I'm adding 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. This white vinegar is 5% acetic acid, if anyone is curious. And I'm just mixing that up. Now, just off camera in this container right here, I have a container that is 8 cups of water with 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, just like we have here, because I figured that I want to keep the pH, the acid concentration, the same between both. So that way, when I add more volume with our dyes to one of the pans, we'll use this acid mixture in there, so that way the spread and everything we're seeing is not because of a pH change. And I suppose that one thing I also could do is when I'm adding to one pan the smaller volume of liquid, I could add just liquid with no dye to it as well to increase the volume of water in the pan, but I'm not gonna do that today. Not everything has to be like a good scientific control like that, Rebecca. We're looking for qualitative here. Now I squeezed out most of the water from the pre-soak here. And so here we have 200 grams of yarn in 1 pan. And I'm coming over with 200 grams of yarn in the second pan. Okay, now I want to start a little bit slow and hopefully we're not going to have any splatter of our color, and we'll see if this is going to work. Yes. I'm going to get 6 milliliters of our turquoise dye. Add it to a cup. Then I'm going to measure out 6 more milliliters of our 1% stock of turquoise dye. So currently both of these containers have the exact same amount of our blue dye. Now in this one, I'm going to increase the volume here until we have 250 milliliters of liquid instead of 6 milliliters. And this is a pretty large increase. Okay, these are graduated containers so that way I can see the measurements on them. Now in this pan right here, I suppose I should stir it for science. I'm going to take this dye and pour it onto the yarn, spreading it out over the yarn. And you can see that, honestly, it isn't that pastel. There is a lot of pigment in there. I have not moved this around. We may do that at some point, but over here, and this is going to be a little harder, I'm attempting to add this little bit of dye across the yarn over there. Now eventually I may go and spread things out, but the exact same amount of dye in both of these situations, one is way more medium toned and the other is incredibly dark. And you'll also notice I was able to spread the dye out over a bigger area, which makes sense because I had a greater volume of dye to start with. This is the big reason why volume can matter in some circumstances. Because if I was hoping to get this dye to cover more of the yarn, you should dilute it first. But I'm gonna go rinse out both of these containers so we can play with another color. And honestly, if anything, we have a little bit more dye total here because there was the drops left in the graduated cylinder are deeper colored. But let's do the same thing with the Hot Fuchsia. See if the squeeze bottle works the way a squeeze bottle should. Sometimes they can get clogged. Okay, I've got 6 milliliters. Colors do always look a bit deeper when they're wet than they do when they're dry. So there's a good chance that this may still be a little bit pastel. But oh man, part of me was like, oh, is this gonna be too much? And maybe. Okay, now I'm gonna fill this with our mixture that has some acid in it. And 250 milliliters is around a cup. We're gonna give it a little stir here. This time let's start with just our 6 milliliters of dye. And I will say pouring this slowly is challenging. 6 milliliters is not very much, so letting that come out slowly so that way it doesn't all go just in one spot is hard. And so even if you want the dye to be more concentrated like we have here versus spread like we have on this pan, sometimes diluting things a little bit can really, really help. There we go. Now I have not touched anything yet, and I will say it's hard. I really want to touch that there, but for a proof of concept, I'm not going to touch anything for a little while. We do have plenty of acid in both so that even at room temperature, some of the colors may start striking, but we also may or may not see spread, and so yeah, we're just gonna give this a moment. Our final color is more of a pre-mixed pastel to start with. So I'm gonna use a little bit more of the silver gray than I did of the other colors. Okay, I've measured out 10 milliliters of the silver gray. And I have 10 more milliliters, and now we're gonna fill up our container. There's no reason why I need to stick with 250 milliliters. I think that if I did something that was a little bit less of an extreme difference, the difference would still be pretty apparent. If I had dissolved it just in 100 milliliters, we would still be able to see the ability to spread more. But my goal is to exaggerate things a little bit, so that way we can get a feel for these differences and when the volume of your dye really does make a difference versus when it may not make a difference. Okay, I'm going to take this gray and I'm going into the middle. And so you can see already there's just a lot less dye in there. Pouring that in, that is a lot more pastel to start with. But if I come in the middle here, what does gray look like when it's really concentrated? Well, it looks almost black. And here you almost don't see it because it's just so much more spread out. Now, I don't want to pick things up and move them right now, because if I were to pick up the pan, that would move the dye within the pan, and that isn't what I want at the moment. I want to give time for things to sort of lock in place at least a little bit before I go ahead and move it. Especially because in here also we'll probably get some spread once I move it. So I'm going to go ahead and set a timer for 30 minutes just to let things sit. And so we'll check back in soon. This is an example here where the volume that we have our dyes mixed makes a huge difference on the type of colorway. And the volume that you mix your dyes in can make a huge difference in terms of technique, especially when something is more hand painted or space dyed like we're showing here today. In terms of tonals, the volume you mix your dyes in doesn't make a difference, because if you're looking at the difference between adding an additional cup of water to a 16-cup dye bath to dye a tonal versus just adding 10 milliliters, that isn't going to be a huge difference. And in either case, you're going to be applying all the dye all over the yarn anyway. So you're diluting the yarn in the kettle versus pouring the dye onto the yarn where the dye isn't able to come into contact with the entirety of the skein of yarn. So if I was taking these same volumes, pouring it in the dye bath before I added the yarn, that wouldn't have made a difference. It makes a difference here because since the dye can come into contact with the yarn before it can be distributed throughout the entire dye bath, that's what's giving us something that is way more concentrated or more pastel, even though it isn't a true pastel colorway. The other thing that I haven't pointed out as much here is that our colorway where we've been dissolving the dye in a larger volume before adding it into the dye bath, the color transitions are a lot softer. Whereas in the other pan, even if we see some spread, we're gonna get a little bit more harshness to some color transition just because we weren't able to spread the dye out as much. So those are just some things to think about. But a lot of times I do say I don't care about the volume I'm dissolving our dyes in. And so I just thought it would be helpful to show a circumstance where I very much do care about the volume that the dyes are dissolved in, because it'll make a difference in terms of the overall technique. We're at the point of the video where debating and waffling Rebecca is going to come in, mainly because I am having a huge touch versus don't touch debate. Okay, because Kat, this is neither pastel nor muted right now, but I do have a plan that'll make it more muted that has very little to do with this video. So I think what I want to do is not attempt to move anything. I'm just curious about the amount of color. There is some gray in there. Okay, and some blue. I'm just a little curious about the amount of color we had in each section. Okay, I'm gonna move the pans over to the stove and start heating them up. Okay, we're now on the stove. Now you'll notice that I did not touch the yarn here, and that is mainly because I don't want to cause it to spread. The heat may cause some spread. Actually, and since I've moved it, I'm seeing some of the blue has some tendril spreading. I think that I want to see where things end up without adding more dye now. But I have a feeling that I'm going to add more gray dye to one of these skeins. But first we'll have a look at the yarn while it's wet side by side before I do any modifications. Here's our other pan. I just turned on the heat. You know, in my head I was thinking, okay, if we use, you know, a total, yeah, I should have realized that, oh, maybe I needed like 1 mil of each color to get it a little bit more pastel. It will be lighter than this once it's dry, but yeah, we'll go ahead and just breathe and wait and see where we end up to decide what we want to do to get the colorway that we want. So I'm going to set a timer for 30 minutes. I have the heat on like medium high right now. I'll reduce it once things start to get nice and bubbly. And so I'll reduce it to probably medium low so we can stay just below a simmer. And then we'll heat for 30 minutes. Okay, it's been 5 minutes. I'm reducing the heat on everything, as I said. But I just wanted to point out, we're seeing color spread, certainly with the pink, likely with the blue. I'm seeing some blue down there as well. So just pointing that out. Sometimes colors start to move once you add heat and they don't move as much when it's cold. But anyway, we are on medium low and I'll see you when the 30 minutes are up. It's been 30 minutes. Let's go ahead and flip our yarn. Okay, we have color on the reverse side too. Less so of the gray. See, our color did spread some. It's really hard for me to not just come add more color here. All right, let's move over to the other yarn. But actually here, I'm gonna turn off the heat and I'm gonna let this sit, I think, just for 15 minutes. Let's do 10 minutes. All the color is absorbed, but why not? A little heat is not gonna hurt anything. I just turned off the heat here. And I'm curious about the amount of white left because I did not push the color through with a spoon at any point. Ooh. You know, this is fun and definitely has some pastel elements. If I had tried to wiggle the color through, we would have had more spread. I am tempted to over dye all 4 skeins, but let's let the yarn, I mean, there's no color left in here. So you know what? I am gonna remove all the yarn now. I don't know why I thought I was gonna just let it sit. That's not what we need to do. I did want to flip it in the pan just so we could see what was gonna happen. But there is no dye left in the water, so therefore we may as well remove it. But now I'm gonna go let all of this yarn cool for a little bit so that way we can look at them side by side before I decide what I want to do artistically now that we've done our experiments. I do plan to over dye both of these skeins with a bit more gray just to even them out a little bit. But for now, the biggest difference that we have here is technique-wise. We have a more intense pink here, even though it did spread some, but we have a lot more white in this skein as well, because again, we weren't able to spread the colors as far because we had less volume. I think we had a total of 22 milliliters of dye we added total here, and a total of 750 milliliters of dye that we added down there. And so the biggest difference that we have here And we do have some white in here, and we have some areas here with less coverage as well. But the biggest difference that we have between the two is just the amount of coverage that we got. And so if you are wanting to dye your yarn and spread the colors more over the yarn, yes, you can add it concentrated and try to move it with a spoon, but maybe it'll strike faster than you expect, because we did have acid in this situation, but I do have some dyes that will start striking the yarn without me adding vinegar to it. So in those circumstances, the better way to spread out that color, especially if there's not a lot of dye, is to increase the volume of water that you have with that dye. Now, there may be times when this isn't what you want to do because you want to have a little bit more control over the spread. And if that's something you want to see me play around with, I can try to do another video about that. In that kind of situation, I would remove some of the yarn if you wanted to prevent the color from spreading onto it, especially if the volume was going to go up and up. But we could talk about a lot of different variations of what we might want to do. But for now, I want to over dye these with a little bit more gray dye. I added the remaining water that I had originally mixed of 2 tablespoons of white vinegar with 8 cups of water to the closer pan that had more volume in it already. And then I added 2 tablespoons of vinegar and 8 cups of water to the far pan, followed by 8 cups of water to each pan. So we have a total, of course there's been some evaporation, of 24 cups of water and 4 tablespoons of white vinegar in each pan at this point. And next I added 50 milliliters of the silver gray dye to each of the pans. There was a tiny bit of leftover dye that I had from rinsing out containers. Throughout the process, I divided that in half and added it to each pan and then stirred everything up so that way it would be more evenly distributed. Ultimately, this is not that much dye that's in either of the pans, but it should tone down everything on both skeins at least a little bit. But things may start striking pretty quickly because we do have acid in our yarn and acid in the pans. I hadn't rinsed the yarn or anything when I added it in. And I know that there's really not that much dye in here. And you should be able to tell that from the fact that the pan doesn't look like there's a lot of dye in there. But I added the yarn to the mostly cool dye bath and moved it around to try to distribute the color all over. Now, this is going to make the color more muted where it's a little more pastel. There will be some areas that are a little bit more bright, but it will tone down things at least a tiny bit. I think that when we move on to our other skein that had the more concentrated dye added to it, there you can kind of see some of the difference a little bit more from adding the gray, because we had white in the yarn before and now we have more gray to it. The color is extremely subtle and pastel, but is bringing some color into our yarn. I went ahead and heat everything for 30 minutes and then removed the yarn off camera to set it aside to cool completely so we could wash it. Let's wash all 4 skeins together. That little bit of extra gray just sort of evened out the color a little bit and things feel a little bit more muted than loud. And not that loud is a bad thing, but I was originally going for something more in the pastel range. I just used way too much dye. Oh man, but I hope this was a good demonstration for all of you. Ooh. The great news is because we used so little dye, there's no bleeding. So I just need to finish rinsing out the soap. Then I can put the yarn through my spin dryer and hang it up to dry. Even though I think that final addition of gray dilutes the difference between the colors a little bit, you can still absolutely see the difference that we have here. When we add that pink straight on, even if we have a darker section here, it is more pigmented when we didn't dilute it than when we did. It's just the pink spread on both. The silver gray is not as pigmented as a color, but here you almost can't tell the difference between the gray on the background. Spreading it out gave such a subtle effect. And then also with the blues, there's just a huge intensity difference here from when you can spread it out with having a greater volume versus not. The volume you mix your dyes is only important when it depends on the effect you're trying to get. In both of these examples, we use the exact same amount of dye. It's just they have a different amount of contrast because with more liquid, we could spread the dyes further. Kat C, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope you're gonna love your yarn. We aren't quite as pastel as originally I thought I might go for, but we did mute the colors a little bit, and I really hope that you'll like it. So Kat, thank you again for being my lab partner today. Are there any other side-by-side comparisons that you would like to see me play around with? I'm toying with the idea of a video for when volume doesn't make a difference. And so maybe we would do a kettle dye in, say, 8 cups of water versus 32 cups of water to show that the yarn can look very similar, maybe indistinguishable in the end, but I don't know. There are times when that volume is much more important and the concentration of your dyes is much more important. And this is a case where the concentration, it really should be, when does volume make a difference? It really should be more, when does the concentration of your dye make a difference? And yeah, this is more about that concentration of dye because we use the exact same amount of dye on both skeins. And so yeah, I think that other video idea I was floating around, ultimately, when you add the dye to the kettles, the concentration would be very similar, and so it wouldn't be as big a difference. But I don't know. I guess I could still do a side-by-side and show that, okay, dissolving your dye, I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you think that that would be an interesting video. I feel like that it wouldn't be much of a demonstration, but I'm certainly always happy to play around with things and showcase what things can make a bigger difference when you play around with them versus not. And some of these things I'm still learning myself because we did see spread of our dyes when we used the concentrated dye, just the little bit of the 1% stock solution that we didn't dilute. But that's because I picked some colors that spread a lot. If I had picked other colors that strike faster and don't spread, the differences here might have been even more dramatic. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. I post at least twice a week, and we have a lot of fun over here. Thank you so much for watching.